Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Andy Pedder, and I'm the host for our webinar, as well as the co-founder and CEO of Deazy. For those of you who aren't familiar with Deazy, we help technology leaders to accelerate and de-risk their technology delivery as a scalable and trusted development partner. We've seen recurring themes in the challenges our clients are facing, and those seem to be consistent with what we've seen from a macro perspective. So we wanted to take today as an opportunity to step back and use the webinar to explore the bigger picture around technology talent strategies. Talent has been an issue for the technology sector for more than a decade, and there doesn't seem to be a quick fix solution. So is it time to take a fresh look at the status quo? That is, the established technology strategies and tactics relating to talent. Well, I'm excited to be joined today by two experts in this field. Katie Tynan, Principal Analyst at Forrester. Katie is an author and expert in the employee experience and future of work, with a strong focus on leadership and organizational development. She'll be sharing insight into workforce trends, forecasted demands on the labor market, and what organizations are doing to adapt. I'm excited to hear about the insights she'll be sharing and how they impact the technology function. So welcome, Katie. Also joining us is Elliot Crush, Director of Engineering at the RAC. Elliot joined RAC in October 2022 and took on the challenge of accelerating their 5-year digital transformation journey. Elliot will be sharing his experience and insights on the challenges he's faced and how he's used innovative talent strategies to overcome them and therefore accelerate the digital transformation journey. Welcome, Elliot. And following our guest speakers, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions during the session, please use please comment or use the question module. Obviously, Katie, Elliot, if you've got questions for each other as you go along, please feel free to ask away. And without further ado, let's get started. So Katie, just before you share some of your insights, it'd be great to get to know you a bit more. So I know you've got 10 years of experience in the technology sector as well as other experience. But I'd love to hear about how you got started and how you got to where you are now. Did you start out writing code?
No, I have never written any code, which is sometimes surprising to people who are not tech people. I think we get lumped together as, we all kind of do the same thing, which clearly we don't. But no, my tech career was completely by accident. I have a psychology degree. I had no interest in tech. I had no intention of going into tech. And then I was the person that wiggled the plugs when people couldn't print a very long time ago. And that's like the gateway drug to becoming a person in IT. If you're the person who says, let me take a look, or, hey, I think I know something about that, the next thing you know, you're in tech. So I did that for 10 years. And no, I didn't write code. I did a lot of Exchange server administration, a lot of infrastructure stuff. I rolled out wide area networks when wide area networks were a thing, which they are not anymore. I have Novell certifications in case anybody has a Novell server that they're, still sitting on after 20 years. So the time that I spent in tech, I learned really that tech is only part of the issue when you're trying to get stuff done. Then there's a whole other thing, and that's the people and the process and the culture and the leadership and the learning and all the other things. So that's how I got over here. I spent 10 years in tech. I spent another 15 or so years more on the HR side of the house. And now what I do for Forrester and for folks like yourselves is try to bring that macro perspective that you were talking about together with that very human-centered perspective of we're human beings trying to get stuff done. That's what employee experience is. How do we create environments where people can do their best work? So that's my jam. And I'm a little bit of an odd duck because I love data. I love the numbers, but I also love the humanity that we can then inject back into the numbers. So speaking of that, I'm just going to show you some numbers. Let's start here with just what's happening in the world, which is weird, by the way. One of my colleagues is an economist by trade, and he and I have long conversations about some of the data that we're seeing in the workforce, because it's very peculiar. And I didn't bring this particular slide today, but we have this long throw data of United States unemployment against GDP growth. And since 1929, right, since the stock market crash, those two things are inverse. So when GDP growth is high, unemployment is low. And when GDP growth is low, unemployment is high. Everybody understands that. That's like Econ 101, except in the last 2 years, when for the first time in 100 years, both of those things have gone down at the same time. So employment is shockingly low. And yet all of last year, what did we all hear about was the narrative of recession. What were organizations doing? They were laying people off, which is baffling, right? We've never seen this. So here we are. We have this 268,000 tech layoffs since 2022 and 268,000 open roles posted in January 2023. We have this very strange talent constraint narrative right next door to this very interesting companies laying people off and a lot of people available for work. So what does that mean? What does that tell us? Well, what it tells me as an analyst who looks at this stuff is that there's uncertainty about something else. It's not just the connection between do we have enough people to do what we need to do? It's do we have the right skills? And maybe the people we have aren't the right people, so quick, let's go out and get different people and let's, throw these people off the side and pull these people on the side. And it's not working. Almost every person that I talk to and client that I talk to is struggling to get stuff done, to have the right people, to have the right skills. And by the way, and this goes back to the title of our webinar today, why do we call this the definition of insanity? Well, what is the definition of insanity? It's doing the same thing and expecting different results. So there has been a tech talent shortage for as long as I've been in tech, and I just told you how old I am and how long I've been in tech. I've been in tech for 25 years, and there's been a tech talent shortage every single year of those 25 years. So I think a lot of us tend to get into this mindset of, yeah, that's just something that we live with. And we're never going to have all of the talent we want, and we just have to live with that. But things have actually changed. There are some new things to look at and to think about. And so that's why our recommendation today, and we're going to try and make the case to you today, that you shouldn't ignore this conversation. You shouldn't ignore the discussion of talent and talent strategy just because it feels like the same conversation that we've been having forever. So what's different? Well, let's start with, what are CEOs worried about? Now, why am I telling you what CEOs are worried about? Well, in 2020, CEOs were really worried about skills development. They were really worried that they were not going to have the right skills and the right people to do stuff. And so I don't know if you recall this, but in 2020, the talent market was pretty weird too. There was this little teeny tiny epidemic going around, and lots of people were getting laid off. And yet at the same time, companies, and especially in 2021, business was booming and people were hiring and trying to get more and more people. So in 2020, CEOs were worried about skills development. But then things changed. And now in 2023, they're not so worried. Only 52% see skills development as their biggest challenge. And it's not even the top thing on the list. So why does this matter? For those of you who are sitting on this call when we're talking about tech talent, why does this matter? It matters because if the C-suite's worried about this stuff, then we get to have good conversations at a really strategic level about what we're going to do about it. But when CEO focus shifts, as it has, it's harder to have those conversations. And so what we have to have is a strategy, right? A strategy that meets our needs and that we can pull up and elevate to the level of executives when they are willing to pay attention, but also that can continue to drive our business forward, even when CEOs are worried about something else. So what are CEOs worried about, right? What is the something else? Well, you'll notice even the top of the list is not as high as that 74% was in 2020. Skills was such a big issue in 2020, and it has driven the narrative for the last 3 years. But now execs have gone back to being worried about customer demand, about regulation. They are still worried about labor skills and shortages, but they're also worried about technology disruptors, Gen AI, that we have heard nonstop this year. All kinds of things are on the executive mindset. And to me, when I look at this, a lot of these things are still labor and skills issues. They're just being described and bucketed under other categories. So it's not that that concern has gone away, it's just maybe gotten a little more nuanced. So I just said a whole bunch of things. And Elliot, I know you live in the middle of this, right? I sit in my ivory tower and I talk about these things from a research perspective. But I'm curious if you see some of this in your daily work in terms of executives' interest in having conversations about talent and skills.
Yeah, I think you summarized. Hi, everyone, by the way. I think you summarized it quite well at the end there, Katie. It's not that labor skills and I think the general people strategy has sort of changed in terms of precedents in people's mindsets. It's more that the problems have become more murky, less clear. Everything, as we all know, is a problem in a business boils down to not having particular people focusing on that problem that can come up with amazing, innovative solutions to that. And I think if you look back over the COVID years, most companies will probably be in the same boat of struggling to do any form of decent year-on-year analysis because their various demand curves or supply curves just differ greatly over those years. And sort of now left in a world where there are a couple of major problems that you've got to kind of work out, but they're not as well defined perhaps as they were before. You had a longer run at those problems, perhaps more continuity of leadership, which led you to get to the deeper problems. And then you get to a point where you have a large shift in direction from something like COVID, where you maybe have a change in C-suite or a number of leadership roles that change. The problems become less clear, and you sort of need to have a bit of time to work through those and understand which ones needs solving. But I completely agree with your sentiment that all of these problems are bucketed more or less straight back in a fundamental concern of lack of labor or skills shortages within your organization. It's just masked slightly differently.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the things that we have seen companies thinking about is how to make the shift from thinking about people in terms of static jobs. So that's one of the things I was talking about with that very first data slide when I said, we've laid off 268,000 people and we've posted 268,000 new jobs. We do that when our company is organized as job descriptions. So we hire people into job descriptions. We think of those people as those job descriptions. We really don't think of them in any other way. And then when we need to shift direction, we get rid of some and we make new roles. But that's not really the right way to think about it. And especially when talent is constrained, that habit works when talent is abundant. And we've come out of a decade of talent being relatively abundant, still not in tech because we've never had abundant talent, but there was more. Now there is less. So I'm going to just show you a model of how we think about that changing. So the job-based view doesn't match either what's happening in the work itself or what's happening in the human being side, right? So neither side is served by a job-based view of talent. So what should we be doing differently? Well, the job-based view is, here's Katie, and well, I told you I didn't code, but let's say here's Mary, and Mary's a software developer, right? And we only think of Mary as a software developer. But Mary is so much more than that. Sure, we know that Mary has a whole bunch of skills, and potentially we could look at her just from this skills-based view and say, okay, we could redeploy her. Maybe the job she's in is not something we need anymore, but she's got all of these skills. But we also know that she has skills she's not using. So I just described to you my career. I have skills that I'm not using, even more recently than my very long time ago database administration, server administration stuff. I did a whole bunch of work with Salesforce for organizations that needed custom reporting. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I had really strong custom Salesforce reporting skills. I don't use those at all in my current role, but I have them. And we all have things like that. things that we've done for other jobs, things that we've done in other places that then we could apply. And then we have another set of skills, and possibly the most important set of skills, which is skills I want to learn, skills that are adjacent to the things I already know, things that would be easy for me to bolt on. So this is the idea of moving from that job-based view to the skills-based view, is that suddenly we have a much larger visibility into what an individual is capable of. So this part of the equation is about looking at employees. But in a second, I'm going to show you that there is also another way to open the aperture and look even more broadly, because it's not enough just to know the skills of your employees. So when we think about what we want, when we think about an adaptive organization that doesn't have to be so rigid and say, these are the people we have and this is the thing we do, we want to be able to say, okay, we're customer focused. What do our customers want? These are products and services we're going to develop and sell. Therefore, these are capabilities that we need. And those capabilities are going to be bucketed into technology and processes and data and people. So the whole skills model that I just showed you before is about people and understanding those people in more depth. All right, so I've been talking a lot like way up here in theory land. I want to bring it to an actual example. So let's talk about, and people ask me this all the time, like, Katie, this all sounds awesome. Tell me about an organization that actually does this. Okay, I'll tell you. So as some research that I did for a report that I recently wrote, we interviewed the US Army. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there who are probably saying, Katie, the US Army is the leader and on the leading edge of skill strategy as it relates to tech talent? And I'm going to tell you yes. And the reason for that is because think about how much technology any military organization now employs in the field. They have so much technology that they are using on the battlefield in the moment. And in the past, what they were doing in the Army, and many other military organizations do this, they were using contractors. And those contractors were coming in and building the software tools that they needed and fixing things that were broken. But there was a problem with that. And the problem is you cannot deploy contractors on the battlefield. So when things were breaking, they didn't have a solution. So their solution was to develop an internal capability to do that through this software factory project, where they take soldiers who expressed an interest and said, this is something I would like to learn. And they put them through a program, and then those soldiers are now building software for other soldiers. And it shortened the time for development, because they were not having to explain to contractors and then having contractors build stuff and then having the contractors go back to the soldiers and the soldiers trying it out, right? It was a straight line between the two. And they were mitigating a risk. And that risk was having deployed software in the field that they could not maintain. So this is just one example of learning as a competitive advantage for an organization to try to do things faster. But here's the problem. It's still not enough. It's not enough to just develop the skills of your people. And here's why. In most cases, this is how businesses think about getting stuff done. They look at that business need, they break it up into projects, they break that up into tasks. We have project managers, we have tasks. But what happens then? Where does that go? Well, there's 4 places it needs to go. One place we call buy. And buy is we go out on the open market and we hire new talent. And a lot of companies have been over-rotated on buy for solving their talent challenges, right? They just go out and hire people, and then they have people and they put them in those boxes and they try to get them to do the things they're going to do, and that makes them a little more rigid. So the second option is what I just described, which the US Army did and which other organizations are doing, which is upskilling or building that talent in-house. So it's taking Mary and saying, hey, Mary, would you like to take this program, learn these skills, go and try some of these things in practice? So buy and build are how a lot of organizations think about getting stuff done. But there's 2 more tools in the toolbox. And when we're living in a talent constrained environment, these two more tools become really important to understand, to leverage, and to use in a much more balanced way. So the third one is borrow. How do we borrow skills that we need for a short period of time? This is strategic partners, it's folks like Deazy, it's other organizations that can provide you with talent on demand in a more flexible and fluid way to get stuff done. And then the last one is bot. And bot is automation. How do we automate some of the things that we're doing so that the humans in the loop are not doing things that are a bad use of their time, but they are still able to control for and manage processes that are being done by automation? So the thing that we need to get to is a matching process that allows us to take that set of business needs and projects and tasks and do a much more effective job of dividing them out between these four different levers. So this whole model looks like this, which looks a little complicated, but the idea is we've got the business needs feeding in at the top. We've got this matching process, ideally some algorithmic or smart technology helping us better understand our talent intelligence, better understand our upskilling capabilities, better understand our partner resources, and better understand our capacity to automate. And all of that flows down to a business outcome on the other side. So I know this is a lot to think about, and I'm going to bring it all the way back to the top and say, the reason that we do this is not because it's a nice idea and it's fun and we look at this and go, wow, that's really interesting. We do it because there's no other way to get things done in this economy, with this workforce, with these talent constraints. We cannot just do what we have always done for decades, which is we'll buy more talent or we'll send somebody to a couple of classes. We have to get much better at balancing these four ways of getting stuff done. Okay, so I have just said a million things, which is what I do. And I'm going to pause now and I'm going to stop sharing and come back. And Elliot, you live this, right? This is your world of how do I get stuff done. So I'm just curious on your side how this works. So I'd love to pass it back to you. And Indy, I know you have a question for Elliot before he gets started.
Yeah, and obviously it'd be great to hear about how this works in practice for you, Elliot. Just before you dive into that and come back to Katie, it'd be great to hear about how did you get to your role as Director of Engineering at RAC? Like, where did you start and how did you get to there? Tell us a bit about the journey.
Yeah, great. I'm happy to do that. I'm probably not going to articulate all the things I'm going to say as eloquently as Katie did there, but it's interesting to draw on some of the links as we get into it. But no, I think I've always been obsessed with technology. I've always enjoyed the simple process of automating things by writing code. I remember very early on just being obsessed with data structures and working out how to store data and all these other bits. And I never really understood and thought of that as a career until I ultimately thought, well, I'll spend a bit more time at university and work it out. But I realized during university that I wasn't really, from a traditional functional sense, obsessed with programming, writing code and stuff. I was more or less obsessed with solving problems, I guess. And I sort of stumbled then into being a software engineer, into various leadership positions. And then, as you go through that journey, as I was saying to a couple of the engineering managers in our team not so long ago, is in tech, when you progress to more leadership positions, you get at the stage just before that is you end up realizing the extent to how many problems you can solve. You start off as a software engineer and you can write a load of code that will put an API response up, that will get a UI working for a customer. Great, you get that instant gratification, you do that. But as we all know, in larger organizations and more complicated use cases, you can get stuck in the mud in that. And you want to be able to influence more, you want to be able to solve more broader problems. They turn into organizational problems, they turn into talent, attraction style problems. So it sort of pushes you in a direction of either deeper technical leadership or a mixture of both, or just on the people side. And I found myself progressing in those points to the extent of then in a leadership position where I am now at the RAC, which is, trying to do my best to look after a fantastic team of people obsessed with fixing customer problems and trying to give everyone their space to be able to have their influence in it. So yeah, that's sort of how I got to where I am. But I still like writing code. I'm not, I absolutely love getting into it, but I do my best to stay away. But yeah, I think that it's quite nice to go from that starting instant gratification from writing code to then getting the gratification from seeing other people write the code and then have their wins within the team. That is the true healthy sign of, I think, any large team, is then when you see all the successes the teams have and the sort of the empowerment that gives them, right?
That's great. Thank you, Elliot. And on that note, I guess you're a year in now at RAC. What Tell us a bit about how you've approached your technology talent strategy, and specifically picking up on some of Katie's points. But also, what have been some of the greatest challenges you've faced along the way?
Yeah. So I think Katie's point very eloquently describes the problem that I see, and I'll start with what I didn't do, which maybe helps shape it a bit better. Is I think a lot of companies fall down as well, where they try and execute, or leaders try and execute the same playbook they've had success in a previous organization in their next move. They say, oh, this team worked really well. We got to a great point. There was great cross-team collaboration. Everyone was really efficient in their sprints and everything worked quite well. And we had great tech. And then you think, right, I'm just going to take exactly what I did there and then come over to this organization and do the exact same thing. And Katie's quite right. Buy, build, borrow, all those different models vary completely differently in different organizations. You may be picking up a team that has no one in it. You need to build it and do it from ground up. You might also be working with a team where it's been well established, but there's been a couple of pain points in there that has ultimately held that team back from going to the next step. So I think the number one thing I always think about is probably trying to work on the model that fits that organization, what's going to work for that team. And I think that's probably the thing I obsessed with most when I started a little over a year ago, when I joined the RAC. But to go to some specific points, I genuinely try and it sounds very generic, but I just try and get great people that love solving problems into rough areas of domain ownership that I know there are going to be problems within the organization. I think spending too much time trying to unearth all the problems by yourself within the first couple of weeks, months, is just completely impractical. And you also lose that unique opportunity to onboard someone with ownership and accountability from starting the problem from fresh. If you come in as a leader and define where all the problems are and then get all the teams up and say, right, problem one, team A, you lose that moment of inertia there. That's the sort of that galvanizes people in a certain direction. So I always try and get people roughly into those domain driven areas. And it speaks to Katie's point around skills mixes and the fact that we used to look at things as static jobs. If you can align people to pillars of domain ownership, sort of like a broad sets of customer cohorted problems, then it's sort of irrelevant what skills are needed there and then and what they need to be, because you've got people centered around that problem. If they need Node.js SQL developers to go in and write a bunch of APIs to build a problem, then they'll start off doing that. But if it becomes an integration problem, they think, well, I need to buy some software that actually does this because we're broadly just reinventing the wheel here. Then it will sort of morph into that. You start to think about better integration people that can help with that and have got experience with the likes of Salesforce, Dynamics, or other things like that. And the problems sort of start to evolve and look after themselves from a skills perspective. And as a leader, you've got to sit in there and have a rough idea on the pain points that are being surfaced up and try and make sure the teams have what they need to be able to bring those skills back in. And a lot of that is essentially a translation exercise with the exec and C-suites of organizations of saying, well, here's what we think the problems are, going to articulate that in a way that sort of resonates with a business value, a commercial value, or a cost, so that other people then have that unanimous buy-in to what that problem is. And then it's really great for the team. They surface these problems, they get to work on them end to end, and they see other people bought into the problem as well. It really it adds huge amounts of value. And I think for me, the biggest thing, I've not necessarily directly learned this in the last year, but in other organizations, is obsessing with what I sort of call stretch onboarding. So not just the first couple of months of people joining an organization, it's obsessing over how they intend to run the first 6 months or even the first 9 months of being in that organization. It's quite easy to when you're hiring, and you can often be in a state of flux when you're hiring because you've got so many people to look through, interview, and make sure they're the right team fit, and have conversations with your team and make sure they're happy with. You can get caught up in that, and actually that can result in you on day one of that new starter joining being going, great, hands off, the team have got it, there's an onboarding plan for 6 weeks, but you've got to obsess on all the touch points that person's going to have over the series of months to make sure that everything is lining up for that person, that they have the right experience and skills, they have the right knowledge within the business, other people are helping them to the extent where they can sort of point them in the right direction, and more importantly, they sort of have that complete ownership with that problem, and being open and transparent during the onboarding stages and even the recruitment stages about what problems you want that person to go in and solve. Talking very generically about that adds huge amounts of value in there, making sure they have those checkpoints with you as they go on through their sort of stretch onboarding. I think that's the most important bit. And I learned a lot from sort of, we're in a little bit of a less volatile place now with regards to the jobs market. It certainly feels like that. Before, where you really had to make offers and make decisions within a very, very, very short period of time. It's quite nice to be able to talk through problems in a bit more of a wider context with candidates now, and have that time to really make sure that you find the right people to focus on the right problems. And I found certainly at the RAC that we've got a fantastic set of software engineers, data engineers that work across our teams. And you find the people that are obsessed with fixing customer problems, they actually then want to change skill sets themselves. And we've certainly got a few use cases of that live at the moment, where people are going, actually, I've heard about this Snowflake thing and DBT and data transformation, and I'd like to go and sort of learn why that's different to what I knew about databases and data warehousing. So I'm maybe going to still do my 9 to 5, but I'm maybe going to have a day or so to start to learn about this. And we've got loads of people that are starting to do that now, which is great for us, because you've got an organization that's huge amounts of domain ownership, and actually having people that have that core understanding of how the business operates moving into a different skills area, it's worth its weight in gold. It really is. So it's good to encourage that sort of atmosphere in the team. And generally what we've tried to do over the last year is have people focus on those problems and then let them move to where the skills they need to and start to learn those things. And we try our best to set people up for that where possible.
Yeah, thank you, Elliot. I've got, I guess, two immediate questions that come off the back of that. I know you often, and I love the way you approach it in terms of putting leaders in a space and letting them solve problems and actually not trying to micromanage. How do you, to what extent do you give them freedom to come up with their own talent strategies within that? So once they've figured out what the problem is and articulated it, and then they start to think about what do they actually need to solve it. How do you think about that challenge, like the top down versus bottom up?
No, it's still with that individual in that position, right? If you fundamentally, if you're given the ownership and accountability to solve a problem, and if I've done my job part and got the right person in to do that, they will think about the whole thing in that. They'll think, well, I'm going to need 3 or 4 people working on this rough area. We're going to need to have these as outcomes for what we're doing. And then the question is, Elliot, can you help make this happen? Can we get those people in? And ultimately, if that person can articulate that problem well, it's a very easy thing to go through, because they've been there, done it. They've done hundreds of deliveries before that. We all know by that point exactly who you need, what type of skills you'll need for those sort of functional problems. But it's very important that person is in a lower level of detail that allows them to then call the shots on the ground for those bits, and they can then have those very generic conversations about what skills they'll need. So, but yeah, you're completely right, Andy. I mean, we've spoken several times on this, and certainly from a load of your team that are deeply entrenched within ours, having points of leadership in those domain areas specifically software engineering leadership, is really crucial in that step, because when you've got a mix of buy, build, borrow, you really need continuity in those pillars. You need people that can sew everything together, identify. I think, Katie, you talk about sort of algorithmic stuff that could perhaps bring this stuff together for us. But in the absence of that, you need people to go, well, we're not quite sure on this, but we need to sort of think about this problem very quickly. Okay, right. Well, let's work with someone to bring in some people almost overnight, so that we can start to think about that problem and then plan it out more robustly. But from my view, you can't do that without those pillars of leadership within each of those teams, because you have communication problems. You don't have the right mentoring structure in place. Things can unravel quite quickly in the absence of that.
Yeah, and so you talk about that. I guess that's your buy piece, where you put the right people with problem-solving ability in there. You give them autonomy to solve those problems and then support them. Talk to us a bit about how have you thought about your wider technology delivery strategy over the last and talent strategy over the last year, and how have you used innovative kind of strategies to accelerate digital transformation at RAC?
Well, I think the main bulk of it comes from working out where you need those points of leadership in those different domain sides. So that's fundamentally it. But you also need to think about, how does the rest of the organization plan work? Quite often when you do digital transformation, we as the agile guys come along and say, well, no, everyone should think about things in 2 week sprints, and then everyone else becomes disenthused with the whole process, and it becomes very hard to articulate how you're actually going to do a year's worth of work for what is proportionally quite a high cost for the business in terms of investment. A lot of people in technology teams, a lot of different roles you need to achieve what on the surface of it seems like quite small things. People see it as a website, or they see it as a series of pages. And quite often the challenge from a talent perspective is working on how you burst your capacity within the organization, so that you can facilitate those more sporadic strategic bits that may well come along. We work to a really clear 5-year plan at the RAC, and we've got sort of complete buy-in on exactly what pillars we need to hit in order to reach that strategic goal. But like with all organizations, there are always things that come in and out, that you need to be adaptive to. And for me, in my team, I try and make sure that we have the right burstable capacity to facilitate some of those needs, so that we, the more longer term, absolutely guaranteed pieces, we know, right, this is the set structure we can put in place here. We get these people solving these problems. But for others, we may need that burstable borrow side of things a lot more. And others, we can afford to sort of have more of that sort of cross-training element to it, and which I think Katie mentioned, there is a sort of build, and sort of that's that trunk of category of talent, whereby, and quite often it tracks towards teams that are solving contact center problems or dealing with operations, actually benefiting from people that already have that domain awareness within the business, and getting them into a place where they can perhaps learn new skills to do that job even better is just phenomenally powerful. Certainly all previous organizations I've worked at for doing lots of apprenticeship style ecosystems for contact center operatives, going through people that are logically obsessed with fixing problems, getting them into software roles. Some of the best people I've ever worked with, because they've come from understanding and obsessing over customer problems for such a long time. They've been on the phone talking to people about these problems for ages. All of a sudden, go to a boot camp, talk about how they can sort of get their process they've been talking about with customers embedded into code, and those people absolutely fly. So, it's more just making sure where to put those rough areas categories of talent, in which areas of the business, and it works quite well. But yeah, you've certainly got to be adaptive to how the rest of the business likes to operate in terms of building teams or working on strategic pieces. You can't sit there in a very isolated environment and work out what just works for you and your team. You have to make sure that's mindful of the rest of the organization.
Well, and I think you're hitting on something really important, which is skills doesn't just mean hard skills. Hard skills are sometimes the easiest to measure. And I think a lot of organizations look at hard skills and say, that's what we need. But there's really 4 domains of skills that we like to think about. So hard skills, can you do the thing? Can you fix the broken thing? Can you write the code? Can you make sure that stuff gets done? Great. Soft skills, can you communicate? Can you collaborate? Can you work as a team? Do you understand how to get things done in the culture and the ecosystem that you're working in? Leadership skills, and sometimes that's just self-leadership. You don't have to be a director to need leadership skills. You need to know how to organize your own time. You need to know how to manage projects. You might need to know how to do small pieces of leadership, whatever role you're in. But you also need to understand human motivation enough to understand how to get stuff done with people. But the last one is business acumen. It's understanding in the larger context, how does this organization work, right? Who are the customers? What are we making? How does the thing that we're working on actually help our organization become successful? And those things, especially the business acumen piece, are different with every organization that you go to. So you're absolutely right what you said before, that the model that works in company A is not going to work in company B, even if those 2 organizations are really similar. But even more importantly, if you don't understand as a technical person the context, the business context into which the thing you're building fits, you won't be successful. You'll make a lot of mistakes and you'll burn a lot of time and energy trying to get stuff done the wrong way because you are not doing it in the sort of in the flow of the business, right? We talk a lot about flow of work learning, but I'm talking about flow of business working. So I think that's a really, really important point.
And I think part of that comes down to visibility of the problem. When people can't necessarily articulate or sort of buy into a problem, it's invariably because they've been prescribed a problem to go and fix, and that is a subset of another series of problems which run throughout the organization. And if you can get that person as close to that original problem as possible, and it could be a particular customer problem, it could be a operational efficiency problem or something, they're more likely to not have to need those meetings of, oh, I've delivered this by X date, and you said I'd fix this problem and I'd go and fix this problem. They're more likely to have the conversations with you, with the ones I particularly enjoy of, we said we would go and do this thing for a week, but this thing over here has changed by this team and that thing's over here. So we feel like the new problem is this. And then they go and fix that. And that's way more healthy than having rigid subset problem style delivery where teams don't have that full bird's eye view of everything that's going on there. And I think if you can get people to the root of the problem in that, but it works a lot. And I think for the way you say human motivation, Katie, that's exactly right. I think certainly my experience with engineers going into more leadership style positions is the mindset. You start off with a mindset of thinking that it's a technical problem again to solve, because that's all you've done. You solved technical problems. So you think, well, this is a technical problem. And then you quickly realize that actually you're in the game of inspiring people to work on those problems ultimately on your behalf and going and fixing them. And if you can work out what gets a team moving more than anything, then you're away, really, aren't you? It's an extremely powerful part of leadership that often gets missed, I think, in technical leadership roles, because everyone gravitates towards thinking it's all a functional tech problem that needs to get done when it's not.
We also have legacy. Andy, I'll just say this one quick thing. It's that we have this legacy in tech. We did a bad thing for a long time, which is that we promoted high performers. And those were the people that we chose to be leaders. And some of them did not want to be leaders. They wanted to be really deep technical people, and they really loved that work. But we made it so that they had to be leaders in order to progress in their careers. So that was a mistake that tech made for a long time. And it has had 2 outcomes. One is now we have a bunch of people who are leaders, who have been leaders for decades, who didn't want to be there, and they don't do it particularly well because they don't like it. And we have a whole bunch of people who left tech because they didn't get the opportunity to move into leadership roles, even though they could have, even though they would have been great leaders, because they weren't the best techs. And so that problem means that now we're in a place where we need to think differently about succession planning. We need to think differently about what good leadership looks like. And to your point, Elliot, not just tech leadership, meaning I'm the smartest person in the room, but human leadership, meaning I can assemble a team that knows what they're trying to do and feels psychologically safe to say, I don't know, that's not going to work. This is the wrong priority, right? All of those things. So
Yeah, I think we've all come across people that have left organizations because they've been not don't want to say the word forced, but they've been shown down an avenue of going into a leadership role that takes them away from what they enjoy most doing. And it it's the
It's quite
it's the
single.
worst thing
It's
to
like
hear,
one
and
dimensional, isn't it?
exactly, yeah, and no one benefits from that. I think that person's leaving. They don't want to leave that organization. They don't want to be pushed into that role. The organization really doesn't want that person to leave either. They think that that's perhaps a career progression for them that enables them to do better, and they've probably not understood that person. And it's a horrible situation to end it. Anything you can do to avoid that at all costs is really important. Yeah, I think one of the things we do, and I've done in previous teams as well, is to make sure there's clear progression paths for technical roles and people-based roles, and even hybrid sort of. Here in the RAC we have clear routes of progression through principal style staff engineering sort of structure that allows you to stay completely deep technical, but with more ownership and more accountability within that. But you are sort of a technical thought leader in all of that, and then allowing the other side, down the engineering management, to be more people focused, but still have that technical capacity within it. I think that's extremely important. And then you can, whether I detect this unnecessarily or what, but you sort of get the feeling when you're on team calls that people are a bit more happy now, and knowing that they have both of those opportunities. They don't feel like they're going through one funnel path. It does make a difference.
Yeah, progression should look different to your point for depending on what people like, what their skills, what their aspirations are. So I feel like we've touched on different types of skills, leadership, culture. But I'd love to kind of come back to something you said earlier and get your perspective on it, Katie. And you talked about how you get the people in the right place, then you think about how you burst and have that flexibility. And I know we've talked before, Elliot, and you talked about for you look at kind of 60% kind of in-house kind of core and then 40% burstable. And I know we've talked about there's no playbook, right? So it's different in every organization. But I'd love to understand from your perspective, Katie, like what patterns or trends do you see? Are there trends that are useful takeaways from across different organizations and from your research?
yeah, so the first thing I'll say is there is no benchmark, and people show up on my doorstep all the time and say, Katie, what's the benchmark for contractors? How many people should I have in my workforce with this? And the answer is it is whatever is right for the work you're trying to do. Now, tech organizations actually tend to be way more sophisticated users of the borrow model than any other part of the organization. And they have for decades because we've had talent shortages and we've had to rely on bringing in on-demand talent to get stuff done. So and there is specialty talent in tech, by the way, that doesn't want to be employees. There are a whole bunch of really high dollar figure people who like being in that sort of more flexible project-based or shorter term relationship-based kind of work. So tech is better at that than some other parts of the organization. Marketing, though, is also another part of the organization that has historically used on-demand labor a lot more than certain other parts of the organization because marketing has rapidly changing technology needs. They have rapidly burstable needs to do certain things. And so they tend to have a pretty good relationship. But I have seen departments that are 10% FTE and 90% on-demand labor, and the opposite. So I don't feel like there's any sort of benchmark metric that says, if you do this, it will work. But what I will say is you have to have the tools in your toolbox before you're ready to use them. And that's the mistake that most organizations make, is they wait until there's a problem, that could be solved by on-demand labor, by the borrow model, or by the bot model, or even by the build model. Build is not fast. Let's just be clear about this, right? If we're doing the fast, good, and cheap thing, build is the slowest and the most, it's not the most expensive way to get talent, but it's slow. But borrow is perceived as being the fast way. That's the shortcut. But that only works if you've already developed relationships with those partners, so that when you're ready to say, hey, we need XYZ, you've already gone through procurement, you've already got the pieces and processes in place, you already know and have taught your managers how to lead hybrid teams that are both employees and on-demand labor. So it's not a good idea to wait until you need it to then start thinking about those different levers of talent. You need to have those tools ready in your toolbox so that you can go at the time of need, as opposed to starting that conversation the day that you decide that you need your workforce to be burstable.
It's so true. It's so true. And you need to almost distance the onboarding of borrow or build or whatever from the actual marginal gains you get from when those people and those processes are fully up and running. I think me and Andy have spoken this a little bit, and Hayley and Andy's team quite a bit, that focusing on the kickoff with individuals. What's the right context? What do they need to know about the problems they're coming in to solve, so that they can come in straight away and be obsessed with that problem? And that involves, working out what the right cultural fit is and predefining all those bits. And then all of a sudden it does feel like a tap, and it doesn't feel like, I'm not going to come up with another analogy that matches the tap. But you're certainly right. When you build teams from the ground up, you obviously need established relationships with recruitment partners. If you're doing it organically, building a tech brand can take several years. Those things don't happen. If apprenticeships and you're doing sort of any cross training in there, again, they take months and months, and you have to sort of not count on those people to be as productive for a great period of time. And likewise, when you go down borrow, you need to have established partners set up, ready to go, going through all that process, that you probably more got internal cost on your side of doing all the procurement, etc. And then all of a sudden you've got that ability to call someone up and say, can you help with these problems? I think that's really important.
And do you have any tips, Elliot, for anyone who's thinking about getting ready, to Katie's point, like having the tools in the toolbox, being ready?
I think pretending like you've got a more emergent problem right now, when you've got the free space of sort of thinking to go through it, is the most important way of doing it. As an engineer, you come back to, right, what tests can you write to try and test that things work? Well, think of this as writing a test. Pretend that you've got the desire or the need in the business to all of a sudden work on 2 or 3 large customer problems that require teams to go and focus on those things. What do you need to be true tomorrow in order to do that? And then go and force yourself to have that. A lot of it in leadership positions, you can often feel you go through lulls and highs and all these different feelings. When you're in those periods where you've got a bit more time on your hands, you've got to force yourself to still think that you've got broader problems to solve, so that you can go and get those things ready. And then when it does happen, you feel way more at ease with everything. You've got the right structure in place. You're not going to have any cultural problems by rushing ahead too quickly and not have the right processes in place, and everyone in the team's aware of why you're doing it. And all of those things make a big bit of difference. But just start thinking about having that problem right now is the best tip, I guess, Andy, in that.
Great, thank you. And we're almost approaching time, so I've got one more question I'd love to ask you both. Actually, it's going to be like 30 seconds each. But we've talked a lot about the right talent strategies, but how do you evaluate and measure whether they're successful? I'll start with you, Katie.
So any kind of measurement always starts with, what were you trying to do? So one of the problems that we see with measurement is that people will just go grasp at the KPIs that they're able to measure, as opposed to what they actually want to know. So I think what you need to do in workforce related measurement is, what are the business problems that you're trying to solve? And then what are the barriers or the obstacles to solving them? And then what you're measuring is how you're reducing those barriers, how you are getting faster at or better at doing things. There's a lot of organizations that will look at cost, they will look at time to hire, they will look at retention, they will look at all of those are good metrics. However, the more you can get at leading metrics as opposed to trailing metrics, and the more that you can narrow your metrics to the ones that matter, the better off you are, rather than trying to measure the ocean.
Yeah, I
Great.
completely
Thank you,
agree
Katie.
on leading metrics for sure. I think for me, it comes down to, do the teams celebrate their own successes, and are they proud of the work they're doing? It is admittedly a very qualitative thing, but you can definitely tell from teams where they are proud of the work they've done. You can see the relationships they form within the team, and sort of that empathy comes across. And I think it's very easy to spot that and say, okay, right, that's a team that's operating really well. And if they're proud and celebrating the outcomes that are the wrong outcomes, then that's perhaps something you've not necessarily influenced correctly to get them focusing on the right problems. But if they are celebrating those and coming to you saying, well, we've had it not so long ago with one of our major app releases we did, the team just so fundamentally proud of the work they've done to deliver those pieces. That for me is the point that shows that the sort of strategy is working. People celebrating their success like that and being really happy with the teams they're in.
That's great. Thank you. And it's probably one for another time, but I know even as you talk there, it's just clear that culture is a hugely important thing for you and your team, but also how you work with partners. And I know the guys from our team that work within your team feel very much part of it, and they celebrate with the
Absolutely.
RSC team, which is great.
It's all about culture. It doesn't matter how hard the problems get. When you've got great culture, people have that like galvanized spirit to go and attack those head on. If you don't have it, then things become very difficult. It's hard to get past that.
And that comes from the fact that you treat that whole workforce as one team, right? In
That's
when
right.
you
Yeah.
separate out the contractors and you say, oh, they're other, then you don't get that. When you say we're all the same team trying to solve the same problems together, you get that. It's really meaningful and important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. That's all we've got time for. So thank you, Katie and Elliot, for joining us today and sharing your insights. It's been really valuable. And for those of you listening, thank you for joining. And if you want to hear more about Deazy, please go to deazy.com or look us up on LinkedIn as well. Thank you. Hope you guys have a great day.